So we're beginning to build up the kinds of things we want to do in Python. We can certainly type expressions directly into a Python interpreter. For example, using an interface such as an idle shell, that shell that I've been talking to as I've been showing these examples here. But that's not going to be as convenient. We don't want to be constantly having to type things in. In general, we're going to want to include statements inside of a program file, a separate file that we store away inside the computer and then use. To do that, we're going to talk about both how we deal with that, but if we're going to do that, then executing an expression from a script that's stored away in a file will not produce any output. When I talk to the shell, it gives me an output, but inside of a script, it's not going to do that. We're going to need to give it an explicit command, and for that we need statements, not expressions. And in particular, if we want to get an output, one of the things that we can do is we can actually use statements like print. And then I can give it an argument. Now, inside the shell, print does exactly what evaluating the expression would do, but inside of a piece of code that I've stored away in a file, it will do something different. And of course, by the way, print can be doing something like actually getting the value of an expression before printing it out. So it gets the value of the expression and then returns it. So we're going to need to have a way of actually specifying when we want to get output showing up on our shell, which I've just done. Similarly, we're also going to potentially need a way of getting input. We're going to write programs or scripts that we're going to store away and then execute later on. We're going to need a way to actually incorporate input from a user. And for that, we'll use a little Python function called raw input. Let me show you a simple example of this. If I go to my shell, my Python shell, and I type in name equal, and then I'm going to use raw input, which is a Python special function. It takes as argument a prompt. So I'm going to give it a prompt as a string, enter your name. It wants a string into prompt. And when I execute this, what raw input is going to do, when I call it, it is going to print that out as a prompt. And it is then going to wait for the user to type something into the Python shell. So if I type this, there's what it printed out. It's now the prompt. It says, enter your name. I'm going to give it something. And what raw input does is it takes whatever's typed in as a string of characters and returns that as a string. So if I give it Eric, my name, I have now bound name to have a value. I can go look at it, and name is now bound to the string Eric. That's great, because it says I've now got a way of using things where I ask the user to provide input. It just did it. And that special function has provided a prompt and then taken input and stored it away. Because raw input takes the input and treats it as a string, if in fact I wanted to give it a number, I would have to do some typecasting. Having inputted in and given it some variable name, I'd have to do an int or a float on that name to convert it into the form I want to make sure I actually now have it as a number. In this case, though, I gave it in as a string. And so now that I've got it there, I can just use it. I said I've just got the value of name, but I could do other things with this as well. For example, I could say, let's print out, and I'm going to give it a sequence of things. Are you, I'm going to use the value of name, and I'll put all of those pieces together, and I can say, are you Eric? And that, of course, is also really nice because now I'm able to use things that I've typed in as input and just use them any place I would like to use them. Okay, once we've got that, now we can start using the variable names anywhere that you'd use an expression. So we just saw an example of that where I said, for example, I've bound the name to a particular string and I can use it elsewhere. Here are some other examples. I can give the variable myString a particular value of too much. I can give the variable weather snow, and then I can print out things by disconcatenating together the pieces, as we just saw. So I begin to start having this opportunity to actually put things together. Now, one of the reasons we'd like to be able to do this in a file rather than just generally is that we can then save it, we can edit it, we can reuse it, we can do things with it that we wouldn't otherwise do if we're just typing directly into a shell. With this, we can start now building up some very simple code. And I want to start with a very simple example. Suppose we actually type the following set of instructions into a file. And I've done that over here. If I go to my Python window, I've built a little file called lecture 2.5 slide 4. And I've typed in a set of expressions. So the first one is going to bind x to 3. The second one is going to take x times x, get that multiplication, and rebind x. And right here, I've got what's called a comment. That is, after that pound sign, I've got some description of what's there. Now, this is a boring little description. It says I'm squaring the value of x. And then I have another set of instructions. I'm going to ask it to print out the value of x. I'm going to have y get some input, turn it into a float, and I'm going to print out some value of that. Having saved this away in a file, I can now ask that file to be loaded into a Python shell. Separately, we're going to talk about details of how to do it, but the simple way to do it here is that I simply use the command F5. Notice what happened over here. The shell restarted. The shell basically said, I'm just reading in a file, and notice what appeared. It did a print. That print came from this print statement. I'd already bound x to 3. I'd multiply it by myself, rebound x to be 9. And now I'm executing this statement, and it's waiting for me to input something. So if I go back over here, and I input the value 4, it reads it in, turns it into a float by doing that type conversion, and then it prints out, remember from back over here, y times y, and gives me that answer. So this is a simple little example of what we call a straight line program. It's a straight line program because I execute each instruction in turn. I simply walk through the sequence of instructions. But you now saw a little interaction, and you see how I can build code in a file, load it into the shell, and have it do some work. All right, there are some observations. We've already made them, but let's just talk about them. You see comments appearing after the pound sign. And while my simple comment here was pretty boring, in fact, in general, I want comments because they tell me things about what I was thinking about as I wrote the code. They're going to help a user understand the decisions the programmer made. And in fact, a really good piece of code should be well commented and therefore should be very readable by a user to understand where things are. Second observation we made is this is a straight line program. There's no variation in the order. It simply walks through things in order. And of course, more programs are going to require more sophisticated control of the flow through the code. And we're going to get to that next.